quickly introduce you then. So we have
you.
Tina Mathewson and Kris Browne from government. Tina Mathewson represents DECO, Kris Browne represents the Chubb steering group.
Fantastic.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Kevin. And Kris and I have combined our presentations so that I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction. Kris is going to talk about the steering group, and then I'll come back with a bit of extra material at the end. So that's who we are. So I just want to give you a little bit of a background around export controls as they stand, because they've actually been around for 40 years or so. And they actually come from 4 international counter-proliferation regimes. So we've got the Wassenaar Arrangement, which looks after conventional weapons, the Missile Technology Control Regime, the Australia Group, which actually Australia devised almost 20 years ago to deal with chemicals and biologicals, and there's the Nuclear Suppliers Group. So there's 4 different regimes, and they're all part of this global effort to stop these technologies, with the aim of stopping the technologies going to individuals, states, organisations that are of proliferation concern. So the way it currently works at the moment is that we have a regulation of physical exports. So if the items that are in the Defence and Strategic Goods list are being physically exported out of Australia, then they actually require a permit at the moment. And that's under the Customs Act of 1901 and the Customs Regulations, Regulation 13E, if anybody wants to have a look at it. That's the way it currently works at the moment, and that's why DECO exists now, because we are regulating physical exports. And that Defence and Strategic Goods list, as has been mentioned, is Part 1 is the military list and Part 2 is the dual use items. Now we actually take the UK list. The UK combine all of the agreed items that have been agreed by those 4 international regimes. The UK takes those internationally agreed lists, puts them together into their legislative instrument, which is used right across the EU, and Australia takes that list, so we plagiarise it. We take the UK list. So that's fantastic. Not as exciting, but fantastic. Thank you. But there are gaps. The way we currently just regulate the physical exports of all these items in the Defence and Strategic Goods list has not been seen as sufficient. So at the moment, if you physically export it, if you put it on a USB and physically export technology, you require a permit. But if you send it intangibly via an email, you don't require a permit. Now, these international export control regimes realised that that was a gap in the counter-proliferation effort. So back in 2003, they decided that there needed to be some brokering controls, and in 2006, they decided that they would need to be intangible controls or supply controls. So you can see by those dates, Australia's had an obligation to introduce controls for a very long time. We are behind nearly all of the other like-minded countries in introducing these controls. So the DTC, or the Act that was introduced in 2012, introduced supply, publication and brokering controls to meet our international obligations. But the control thresholds that are in the Defence and Strategic Goods list are actually quite, they're designed to capture only what is considered necessary. So I've put an example there that's been given to me by our technical advisors. So if you take a computer that is specifically designed to operate at extreme temperatures, then it's only the technology that's necessary for that computer to operate at those temperatures that will be controlled. It's not generally the technology that's required for those computers. It's only the technology or the software that's specifically required for those functions of that computer. So what is supply? I'm going to just hit very quickly through what is meant by the legislation in these three broad areas: supply, publication and brokering. So supply is when a person in Australia will be sending controlled technology in a non-physical form, so something electronic, to somebody outside Australia. It's not like the US system. We don't have controls on transfers inside Australia, so you don't have to ask what are the nationality of the people that you're sending stuff to in Australia. It's only when you're sending it overseas. So we don't have deemed exports as the US system does. It also covers if you're going to actually be supplying somebody overseas with access to technology. So if you're providing them with a password or something along those lines. Publication, and I think it's important to understand why this control is here, and it goes back to that idea that there's an exception in the DSGL for information that's already in the public domain. So if something's already in the public domain, it is no longer controlled, so it can't be controlled anywhere in the world. So that's not just in Australia, but all of the other regimes have the same exception for information that's in the public domain. So there's a control on publication, and that's because once it's in the public domain, then it is no longer controlled. And that control applies to people located in Australia or Australian citizens or residents anywhere in the world. Brokering, I'll just go over it briefly. I think people are less likely in this forum to be affected by the brokering controls, but because it's in there, I think it's important to just touch on it. So that's when an Australian an Australian resident or somebody in Australia actually organises or arranges for somebody overseas to move Defence and Strategic Goods List controlled goods or technology from one place to another, and they receive a financial or other benefit for making that arrangement. That's what the brokering controls around. And that's implementing an obligation we've had since 2003. So, I think everyone can understand that these new controls are more challenging to regulate than our current physical exports, where we have a customs, where we have a border force that can assist us in the regulation of movement of things overseas. But in 2012, when the original legislation was going through Parliament, there were a lot of concerns that were raised by stakeholders. And it was at that stage that government agreed to put the legislation into a 2-year transition period that would be overseen by the stakeholder-led steering group. And that transition period is coming to its end, but we are now moving into an implementation period, which I will talk about after Kris has spoken to you about the steering group process.
Thanks, Tina, and thanks, Kevin, for holding this forum. I think it's a good opportunity to get out and make sure that we're engaging with stakeholders. It's one of the reasons we're involved, and we're keen to make sure that we do everything we can to support the sector. Just one point of clarification. I'm a member of the Department of Industry and Science, and I represent the Australian Government in that respect. I don't represent the Chief Scientist. He's independent of government. And I don't represent the steering group either. There are a number of independent members and interested parties on that steering group. Now if we change the slide. So my involvement, I got involved in this 3 years ago when there were representations made to our minister, who we had a lot of ministers around that time. I think it was Kim Carr.
It was.
Because of the concerns that the sector had, university and research sector had, with regard to the legislation. There were a number of discussions held with Defence and with the sector trying to come to grips with what it all meant. The chief scientist held a couple of round tables early on in the lead up to the passing of the DTCA Act 2012. And as Tina said, the 2-year implementation period was introduced with the steering group. The membership of the steering group, chaired by the chief scientist, there are 2 representatives from the university sector. They're Peter Hoy, Vice Chancellor at the University of Queensland, and Mike Calford, who's the Provost down in the University of Tasmania, although he's moved from Newcastle to Wollongong and further south down to Tasmania over the period of the steering group, as he's been promoted along the way. There are representatives from industry and government. So our department is represented on the steering group, Department of Defence is represented, the NHMRC and the ARC both represented. So the entire role of the steering group is to look at the legitimate concerns of the science and research sector, work with Defence on what the options are to actually overcome them. So some of the early concerns from the sector included the restrictions on academic freedom, the imposition on publication and the like was seen to be against the remit of researchers and of universities and research organisations. The administrative burden that would be imposed on research organisations, and that initially I think that would have been quite significant. Ordinary scientific collaboration and with international partners was thought to be captured by the brokering controls because of the definition that had been included for brokering. The complexity of the DSGL is the other issue. The DSGL is complex. I don't think there's any real getting around that. But what is being done is some tools to assist in understanding the DSGL. How do you search it? How do you interpret it? It's a bit like anything, you know. Until you're actually doing it, I'm not sure that anyone could explain to you how to interpret the DSGL or how it applies to your specific circumstances. So the steering group established a pilot program. There were, I think, 7 or 8 pilot organisations all up. Curtin University is a medium-sized technical university. University of Queensland is a large research-intensive university. QIMR up in Brisbane. The CRC for plant biosecurity. CSIRO and ANSTO were both involved. And they've worked quite hard in relation to understanding what it means for them, how they would go about applying compliance arrangements within their organisation, looking at specific activities that they're undertaking and how this legislation impacts on them. And that's looking at some of the international programs that they have, and those organisations have quite big international programs. The other thing I'd like to point out in terms of my role, this Defence Trade Controls isn't all I do. I also manage Australia's only 2 international bilateral science programs with India and China. So I also have a vested interest. The last thing I need is my programs not being able to operate as a result of this legislation. So I'm certainly not going to let Defence get away with introducing something that puts me out of a job. And these days there aren't many jobs to go to in the public service, so. So the steering group, through the pilot program, have been looking at, well, what are the issues and what are the alternative approaches that can be adopted so that we meet our international obligations and protect Australia's national security and global security without it being a situation where universities and research organisations simply can't undertake their core research activities. Research is a huge issue for Australia in terms of what we do, what we contribute 3% I think it is now to global research output. We have to engage internationally. If we don't, we will simply be left behind. You know, we have to buy in research, but we also have to promote our own research activities internationally. So we need to make sure that we're not hamstringing ourselves and our future by the introduction of this new legislation. So Defence have, or through the pilots, Defence have been able to, in the amendment bill, now come up with a number of changes, and Tina will talk to those. Now, the view of the steering group, as I interpret it, and the view of our department, is that it has gone a long way to ensuring that the legislation meets its policy intent and the researchers can get on with ordinary conduct of research. It may mean that, yes, you need to apply for a permit. It may mean that, yes, you need to go through some additional administrative steps. This is not ethics. So, having worked in science and research policy for 17 or 18 years now, including 8 years at the NHMRC, I know what going through ethics clearances and the like is how difficult that can be at times and how long that can take. We're not looking at something that is that burdensome in terms of applying for a permit. So yes, you may have to go through that process, but we are working on tools and mechanisms and arrangements that will assist institutions in that. So what we're working on, firstly, in testing some of these alternative approaches, we've developed some case scenarios out of the pilot program. They've informed the steering group, which has subsequently informed the development of the amendment bill, which passed 18 March, I think.
It got royal assent on the 2nd of April.
2nd of April, yeah. And on the 17th of February, the steering group held a stakeholder forum. So we weren't in a situation to make it an open forum to everyone, unfortunately, and so we targeted quite a broad range of people. I think there were 40-odd stakeholders able to represent the breadth of industry and the research sector to confirm people's feelings and understandings of the amendment bill. The general consensus was that nobody's happy about new regulation. They never will be. But that the amendment bill went a long way to addressing a number of the initial concerns that have been posed by the research and university sectors. A number of the submissions, the Senate committee supported the passing of the amendment bill and the importance of it passing rather than the Senate blocking it. And as I said, the steering group and our department think that for the time being we're in a pretty good outcome, and Tina will talk to some of the longer term activity that's going to happen. But what I will say is we'll remain involved, our department. We are responsible for science policy. We certainly don't want a situation where science and research in Australia is prohibited as a result of this legislation, and we're more than happy to engage in forums and work with stakeholders to that end.
Thanks, Chris. How much time have I got, Kevin?
1.5 minutes.
Okay, rightio, let's go. Okay, key amendments. I think a lot of this has already been covered, so I'm just going to hit on a couple of highlights. We've got the new exceptions in supply, which you'll be most interested about, with the verbal supply and pre-publication supply. So that's when you're actually looking to publish something and you're sending your draft publication overseas for peer review to publishers. Along those lines, you won't need a permit. Publication, this is the biggest one that's actually affected the academic sector. Previously, in 2012, if we go down to the second lot, we were looking at approval being required by the Minister for publications of dual use technologies. That's no longer required. No approval is required. The Minister has retained the ability to prohibit a publication in very limited circumstances, and it would be after a very lengthy natural justice process. It wouldn't be anything that was that you didn't know about and that you just got whacked with a prohibition notice. Okay, I'm skipping through brokering because I don't think it's as much interest. Some additional changes. Permits don't have to be transactional. Each time you're thinking about doing something, you could come to Deco every time, but the idea is that the permit will cover the length of your project, your research project. So you come at the start, you talk about who you're going to be collaborating with, and the permit will either last for a period of time or for the length of your project. It's not a transactional system where you have to come every single time. That's the idea. Legislative review. We don't think that this is 100% correct. As Kris said, we think it's a step in the right direction, but there are legislative reviews built into the legislation. So the first review will be 2 years after the start of the legislation in 2018, and then there's 5 yearly reviews required after that. So the next step, as I said, the bill received royal assent on the 2nd of April. We're now in a 12-month implementation period. The offence provisions do not come into force until the 2nd of April next year. Okay? So we're in an implementation period. The offence provisions, when they come in, will not be retrospective, so you don't have to worry about anything you've done now or previously. However, if you want to get ahead of the curve, you will be able to come to DECO, start applying for permits, start working out whether your technology and software is controlled from the 16th of May. Implementation period, they're the things that will be going up on the DECO website. The second one down, the online tool, is actually where you'll be able to go in and it will take you to the right parts of the DSGL. You'll actually be able to put in what you're going to do, and it will tell you whether your activity is controlled as opposed to whether your technology is controlled. And there'll be FAQs and things like that that you'll be able to have a look at. So where can you find more information? That's the DECO website, that's the steering group website, and questions are at the end, so ignore that.
Could you go back to brokering, please?
Sorry?
I'm a broker, technology broker. Could you go back to brokering?
Oh, sorry. Is that all right, Kevin?
Yeah, you've got 4 minutes or 5 minutes.
Oh, sorry, I thought you said I had 1 minute.
No, 9.5 is what I said. Back. That's okay.
Sorry, guys.
You
Okay,
can just extemporize, that's it.
I do apologise. Brokering amendments. Okay, so there's 2 different slides. One is for military technology and the other is for dual use. You'll see that a lot of the controls, I'll take this more slowly now, a lot of the controls actually change depending on whether you're dealing with military technologies or dual use technologies. So if you are brokering in them, and because military technologies are more sensitive than dual use technologies, generally speaking, the controls have been loosened up in the dual use part of the DSGL, but they've been kept quite tight in the military part of the DSGL. So there aren't as many amendments in that first part. So, say for example, you are arranging for military equipment to go from one place overseas to another place overseas and you're getting a financial or other benefit for it, a permit will still be required. However, if you're going to be arranging for that to go out of a country that's members of all those regimes, and they'll be listed in a legislative instrument, then we say let's not put a double layer of regulation on it. Because those countries have good export controls, we'll leave it to those countries to actually impose their own regulation on it, and we won't require brokering regulation on top of that. So that's in the military list. And in the dual use list, it's gone into a situation again where it's generally, with a few exceptions, no permit required. We have retained the ability in the dual use, if you're brokering dual use items overseas, we have retained the ability to tap someone on the shoulder and say, we actually require you to come to Defence for a permit, because occasionally we get information about people doing things for WMD purposes or for military purposes and they're brokering. So we've retained the ability to be able to tell somebody that they need to come for a permit, but otherwise it's unregulated. That's the changes that have happened in the brokering space. Now that I've got time, I did want to talk about this third point here on this additional change. Now, you won't find this in the legislation because this is something that we're doing from a policy measure, but we're actually opening up in the EU and the UK. They have these things called open general licenses. I don't know if anyone's heard of OGELs or something along that nature. We're doing a similar thing here in Australia. So if you're sending low-risk items, low-risk technology, low-risk software to low-risk destinations, and they'll all be listed, you can come to us for a general licence which will cover your activities. Okay, so this is separate to project permits, which is you coming to us to say, this is my project, this is who I'm going to be collaborating with, this is the sort of technology I'm going to be sending them. This is an open licence if your items are on the list of low-risk items and you're dealing with low-risk countries. So they're going to be the countries that are members of those export control regimes. So EU, UK, US, Canada, Japan, those sorts of countries. You won't actually require a permit for your project. You can operate under an open general licence. A lot of other countries actually do. We finished?
No, actually, as long as you've got time and you're doing this, I'll ask it.
I thought you said no questions.
But you're finishing so early.
Yeah.
So as long as we're talking about open general licenses, would they have the same enforcement procedures that is...
There's record keeping requirements. So when you get your open general license, so you'll apply for one and you'll get a document that you can use because they'll apply for physical goods as well as technological goods. There'll be some record keeping requirements that you need to keep. I also wanted to mention the original legislation in 2012. There are actually two parts to that legislation if you're actually going to go read it. And I don't, I think it's exciting. I don't know about you, but the original legislation has these provisions which are about strengthening Australia's export controls, and they're in part 2 and towards the back of the legislation. It has totally separate parts for implementing the Australian and the US trade treaty, and they're in parts 3 and 4. There are provisions under the US trade treaty provisions. There are provisions in there to visit premises and make checks. Under the strengthened export control provisions, there are no powers to visit premises. The only powers are to actually, for the Minister to write and seek information and to get some documents from you.
Thank you.